Thank you. When I was asked to speak at the event, I gave my credentials, and I was really surprised to see the German flag with the presentation. While I'm German, I actually got my geothermal upbringing here in Iceland, so I'm quite grateful for that. But this presentation is on behalf of the Canadian Geothermal Energy Association, so the Canadian flag would have probably been a bit more appropriate, but fair enough. I wanted to kind of touch a little bit base on the previous speakers here, because there were some points that I kind of wanted to maybe touch upon. Like Gudmundur was saying, the Edel, a former colleague of the bank, I think we learned a lot from our geothermal reservoir engineers in the bank. Particular kind of, we learned how little we know, and I think that's accompanied myself in my current role and in previous activities quite a lot in geothermal. So thanks for, in your presentation again, telling me how much I don't know. On the US presentation, there's one element that and people know me for being really outspoken about certain things, but one critical remark I wanted to make there was that the current drilling rig numbers in the US is actually quite concerning with regards to the predictions of megawatts in development in the US. And I think that's something that, particularly from a policy perspective, would have to be reflected in the US. So there are currently only 3 drilling rigs drilling for geothermal in the US, and that's a huge concern, particularly with the predictions that we do for the US. I wanted to touch base upon Oliver's presentation from ESOR. ESOR has been so kind to host me in their building the past 2 years. And I particularly like the notion of talking about better exploration data that is needed for the work in geothermal. And because it touches upon a little bit of what I'm trying to present with regards to the quality and standards of reporting that data. No. Yeah, indeed. But as was said, I represent Think GeoEnergy, a geothermal news website. If you don't know it, check it out. It's pretty cool. It provides, for example, a map, a geothermal power plant map with details about all geothermal power plants in the world, including locations. And for most of those plants, actually, you can kind of go down all the way down to the cooling tower, which is quite interesting. I also cover videos like the CNN video, so if you don't have access to CNN, you can watch it on my website. We've just introduced a geothermal business directory on our website, so if your company is not there, listed there, but we will definitely try to list companies ourselves in the coming days. Again, I present this on behalf of the Canadian Geothermal Energy Association, whose executive director I was until last year. The presentation yesterday on financing, that's part of our work within the bank in those days. And what I wanted to kind of briefly show here, this is basically the financial structure of geothermal projects, or the sources of financing for geothermal projects. And while I'm not going to go into detail here at all, what is crucial here is the level of data that needs to be available at the certain stages for the different recipients. So that kind of defines in many ways of the data that you have to present and certain standards. What standards and rules, guidelines, or codes basically do is that they help to kind of overcome a certain uncertainty with regards to data available. So flexibility in reporting basically creates uncertainty. And greater uncertainty about the data that you present a greater risk to investors. And that essentially kind of results in a less confidence in geothermal development by investors. And that is something that we all face very much so, because we all seeking for funding for projects. And The geothermal reporting code, as I presented here today, is simply a minimum mandatory set for requirements for public reporting on resource and reserve estimates. There are currently two codes in place, the Australian Geothermal Reporting Code and the Canadian Geothermal Code for Public Reporting. The Canadians and the Australians have very closely worked together on those codes. The Australian code was first, and the Canadian code, not to say it's a copy, but it is very close to the Australian code and has essentially the same terminology and definitions. The background of those codes and why these codes are in place are founded in the natural resources background of both the Australians and the Canadians. And to put this a little bit in perspective, the Toronto Stock Exchange and the Toronto Venture Exchange represent about 58% of the world's public mining companies. And 90% of all the global equity financing for the mining sector has been done on the Toronto Stock Exchange in 2011. So the reason I'm telling you is simply that the mining industry has used the public markets to raise funding for their projects. And while the geothermal sector is definitely quite different, it is also a natural resource sector, and that's why the stock exchanges have been a very interesting target by geothermal developers to raise funding. And the belief is that if there's an investor base that understands risk of development of geothermal resources, then you can maybe use the same forum to raise money for geothermal projects. So that's why the Canadian and the Australian Stock Exchange, which are both very strong and represent, I think, nearly 90% of all mining companies that are listed. So what happened is that the mining industry the global mining industry has created a methodology that is consistent across all the main jurisdictions that are reflected in mining. And the manifestations for those have been applied by both the Canadian and the Australian institutions and associations. And most importantly, the codes that have been created for those sectors have been applied by the security commissions in those countries. So when you list in a public market like a stock exchange, you are bound by regulations by the security commissions. So that they impose standards for reporting of mining data. Petroleum data, exactly the same thing. So the security commissions police essentially the reporting of data for those industries. Importantly, the reason for the Australians and the Canadians working on those codes has been simply the reason is that we wanted to do those codes from within the industry instead of having someone from outside the industry impose rules and standards upon us where they don't have an understanding of geothermal. So that's why the Australians, and particularly in Canada, have been very active in creating those codes and have been doing this quite pushy. Because we're afraid that we might get imposed standards by the security commissions that are not favorable for geothermal. In the petroleum sector, the same thing here. The Society of Petroleum Engineers and the World Petroleum Congress have jointly proposed standards for booking petroleum reserves and have essentially created guidelines for the evaluation of those resources. And so essentially today there's both in the mining sector and in the petroleum sector, there are globally accepted standards that are in place, and that's how the public companies but also non-public companies report both reserves and resources. The geothermal codes provide a two-dimensional classification. They are based on the mineral and petroleum classification to provide a similar terminology. So number one, it's the reliability of the information defining the physical resource. And the second part is the commercial extractability of the resource. So a twofold element. And those distinctions that come from the mining and the petroleum sector have been applied to geothermal by the Australian and the Canadian reporting code. In the reporting code, the occurrences of geothermal energy is defined by resources that are considered to be sub-commercial and the reserves that are commercial definition of those reserves. And there's the three levels of increasing geological confidence. So you have an inferred resource, indicated or measured. So if you look at exploration results, it's something that Oliver touched upon, is the more you know, the more confident you have about your resource and the potential extraction of energy from your resource. So if you look at the geothermal resources, which is the non-commercial, sub-commercial element, we have this level inferred, indicated, and measured. And then you have the reserves, where you have which define the commercial element of your resource, and you have the probable reserves and the proven resources. And all of that basically implements the consideration of recovery, conversion, and the economics, etc. I hope that's somewhat readable. This is a checklist that was created by investment firm out of Toronto that has been heavily involved in the code and has been a big proponent of the code. And that basically goes through the checklist of geothermal development and on the financing and the data. So here, number 1 to 9 defines the sub-commercial element before you drill, and you've actually provided more data for a probable reserve. And then basically you drill, and until you've actually produced power, that's basically when you've proven the commerciality of your resource. Until then, you don't have a proven resource under the code. One of the crucial elements of the reporting code and the reporting under the code is the definition of a qualified person that can make statements under the code. So to be code compliant, the report must be created by a qualified person. That is defined somewhat different between the Canadian and the Australian code, but essentially they define a level of professional experience. And they define that you need to be registered with an association that has a governing code of ethics. And given that I have a legal background, I always compare this to the Bar Association for lawyers. So in order to be able to act as a lawyer in front of a court, you need to be part of the Bar Association, and there's a code of ethics part of that association. So if you don't fulfill those code of ethics, you basically can be taken away your license to practice. And the same basically applies for the qualified person definition under the Australian and the Canadian code. So since we don't have a professional association that would define professional expertise within the geothermal sector, the code defined that a bit more openly than in the mining and in the petroleum sector, where we say you have to be part of an industry association that has a code of ethics that basically would define, if you don't fulfill certain ethical requirements, you can be taken away that license, and that license in that case would be being a qualified person under the code and being able to report code compliant. In the US, and I was part of the board of the Geothermal Energy Association in the US, and I actually was part of the committee that was looking into creating a code for the United States. And in the United States, and that's sometimes for people that are not from the United States, sometimes hard to understand, there's a strong fear of legal liability. And that was the underlying theme of all the discussions that we had in the code committee of GEA at the time. And essentially the result was that the US was not ready to create a code but instead they've chosen the path of creating standard terms and definitions for reporting of geothermal data. Naturally, the Australians and the Canadians are relatively critical of that approach because, well, they're not critical in the sense of the approach itself, just creating terms and definitions, but they are not providing any requirement for using that terminology. And that creates, essentially, in the global scheme, a greater uncertainty. The other issue is that the Canadians and the Australians have with the US terms and definitions is that they provide different terminology. And different terminology, not necessarily from the Australian and the Canadian code, but also from terminology being used by the petroleum and the mining sector. And that we see somewhat critical, but we are in a process of discussing ways of how we can solve this, because essentially we believe that we really need a global approach to that, and for that is very, very important. There's current work on a European reporting code, and I've had several discussions with a number of people that are working on that. That's part of the GeoEnergy project. And there are discussions about a European-wide standard, but the challenge in Europe is that despite this being a political union, the stock markets are very national, and there's a very national notion about those stock markets. So the security commissions in the individual countries are still very strong, and you would basically have to create kind of like a codification approach for each individual jurisdiction. And that's naturally a bit tricky, but, and I think that came through in some of the discussions I had with people, is that there is a belief that we need a European-wide approach to that, and that should include using similar terminology, or the same terminology as in the Australian and the Canadian code, and using the experience thereof. But then try to kind of, in cooperation with the national security commissions, to create national standards that are based on a European code, essentially. The codes, as said, are applied for the Australian listed companies and the Canadian listed companies, and given the international work of those firms from those countries that are listed on those markets, codes have been applied for projects in Australia, in Canada, in the US, Chile, Indonesia, Nicaragua. In Spain, there's an Australian firm having a project there. In Iceland, in Argentina, also in New Zealand, and in the Pacific. And we naturally kind of see the codes as a very good tool to kind of provide some stronger confidence in reporting data for geothermal. They still require you providing good data, but it's the code provide a way of how to use, what terminology and standards to use in the presentation of that data. You don't necessarily have to be Canadian or Australians to apply the code. Essentially, we don't care if you apply the Australian or the Canadian code, but we believe the codes provide a great tool for creating greater investor confidence. Here are some sources in the presentation. The links to the codes can be found here. Some additional sources here. Given that some of the people that have supported us in the code work, I would just briefly like to thank ESOR and Manvit, in the form of Vatnaskil, who've supported us quite strongly in the creation of the code and in the administration of the code. So thank you very much for your help on that. Again, Think GeoEnergy, we also introduced last year a Spanish version of the website, piensageothermia.com. Check out the website, and if there's some news missing on the site, please send them to me. It's hard to keep up. I posted, I think, 7 news pieces last night after dinner. Thank you very much.